Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out in the rainy DC weather today. So I'm Daniel Castro, Vice President of ITIF. Welcome to today's event on how Americans feel about AI and why it matters. This is the second year we've had the opportunity to partner with Public First on a public opinion poll around how Americans think about AI. Chance to look at last year's data. It's a really interesting deep dive in how people are thinking about it. And I think what's really interesting about tracking this is that this is a technology that is in front of us every day. And so I think with most technologies, Americans start off with high levels of fear, and over time it starts to get better. I'm not sure how fast that will happen with AI because the technology itself continues to change. So you're not really asking about the exact same technology every year. It has changed every year. But over time, I think we're likely to start seeing some interesting trends. But really happy today to have Jonathan here, Jonathan DuPont, partner at Public First, a polling company based out of the UK, to talk through the results. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a panel conversation afterwards with Matt Milstead, Technology Policy Research Fellow at Cato, and Miranda Bogan, the Director of the AI Governance Lab at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Both really great experts, people I love reading their work and hearing their thoughts on AI and AI issues. So we should have a great conversation. For those of you that are joining online, if you're watching on our website, you'll see a link to something called Slido. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or any of the other platforms, in the video description, you will find a link to this. You're welcome to submit your questions for our panel or for Jonathan. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If you're in the room, you can also submit online, but you can also just raise your hand and you can just ask your question directly. Without anything else, Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Really looking forward to hearing you talk about the results, and then we'll get into the discussion. So thank you.
Let's see if that works. Okay. Thanks very much, Daniel. You slightly preempted a couple of things I was going to say at the top. That this is I think this is actually the third time we've run this. We've done this twice with these guys, and then we did it once before. And it's always been this kind of interesting kind of trade-off between having this kind of year-on-year trend, but then AI keeps changing exactly what it means every 3 months, and trying to kind of like have the balance between those two has been an interesting challenge. There's kind of, before we dive in, I think I would just say there's kind of, as a preview, 4 kind of themes that really jumped out at me at the data this year. So the first theme is that, and this is true the last year and the year before too, but that we really see kind of a mix of attitudes, that people both have kind of positive feelings and they have negative feelings. But what I think is true behind all that is that whatever they feel about AI and they're not quite sure, they think it's something real and it's going to have a big impact in the next few years. We didn't really see any signs of people saying this is just overhyped bubble. Is it going to mean anything? 2, that it's kind of starting to become more and more embedded in people's kind of day-to-day work. I think SEMrush says ChatGPT traffic up twice year on year. And in our polling, you saw people are kind of really finding it helpful tools. They're using it in their day-to-day job. And that it's kind of leading them to think that actually this will probably affect how my job it's done in the next few years, which has positive and negative sides. One kind of tangent to that is what people see this kind of big economic impact in the kind of abstract. They're less sure in their heads. It connects a lot less to kind of day-to-day, how does this actually affect my own wages kind of thing. We didn't really see that divide, that leap people find hard to do. Theme 3, I think increasingly when you talk about AI, you have to talk about AI in kind of an international context and kind of a geopolitical, and that kind of came up in a lot of places, from drones all the way through to model sovereignty. And one thing we did this year is we didn't just run the poll in the US and the UK, we also ran it in a few Asia countries too, in Singapore and India, to kind of get more of an international look. And then all of that kind of ties together into kind of the policy landscape, where I think it's best to say it is nuanced. There are very few people saying, other than maybe Ted Cruz, saying they don't want to regulate anything, and there are very few people saying they want to regulate everything. And you see that across kind of political parties all the way through. We'll get into more. Okay, let's dive in. So starting off with attitudes. So if I can get the clicker to work. Okay, so this is to start off with what I was saying about people not seeing AI as overhyped. One question that we asked in 3 years running now is whether they think AI is developing faster than expected, about the same speed, or slower than expected. And we continue to see it slowly ticking up, actually, that people think AI is developing faster than expected. They're quite impressed by how things are changing. What does that mean? They have mixed feelings. So we still see kind of interest and curiosity is right at the top. That's the leading emotion they associate it with. Worried and anxiety have actually ticked up a tiny little bit year on year. But I think the balance of this is still kind of this kind of mix of emotions point that people don't know quite what to make. It's a mix of everything. Another way to ask this is we ask people whether they think it will make it better or worse for a range of things, for them personally, for their career, for most people they know, for the economy, for society as a whole, and for the next generation. And we see, on average, people are just about kind of steering towards the positive rather than to the negative, although it is, again, quite mixed. But it is interesting. It is more positive than negative for kind of the big abstract things for the next generation of society. When we get to them specifically, their career or them personally, they're a bit less sure about it. Either way, this is what I was saying about they think it'll have a significant impact. So we asked a series of questions where we asked people basically a binary trade-off choice. Do they believe A more or B more? And then, so the oranges are one choice, the blues are the others. So the first one, will AI have a significant impact in their country? As you can see, the orange is way higher than the blue for the country. For them personally, however, like the blue is actually higher than the orange. They're not sure that AI will have a significant impact on them personally. Will it help them do their job better? Orange is slightly above. Blue will put their job at risk. And then will it make the world safer or will it make the world more dangerous? Blue is a little bit above orange. So again, we're just seeing this kind of mixed pattern across, but big impact. Another issue I think about a lot in the concept of AI is climate change. It's quite abstract, it's global. A lot of the impact only happens in the future. How do we really feel about it? And I like to compare how people feel about those two. And so one thing we'd ask is just whether people think which is having more of an impact on them. It's what AI have a bigger impact in their country or climate change. And at the moment, we see it's about equal. Obviously, there's quite a big partisan divide on that. Trump voters are much more likely to say AI, Harris voters are more likely to say climate change, but it's roughly equal. If we ask what will have a bigger impact going forward in the next 4 years, AI comes ahead quite a lot there. If you look at the country as a whole, more people think AI will have a bigger impact on their country than climate change. Okay. And then one reason they might expect it to have a big impact is as all the heads of the AGI labs, well, they all keep hinting that they think they might create AGI before the end of Trump's second term. So I've asked this in quite a few different ways in different polls when people think the first human level AGI will be built. This one from this poll, it was about half the people had an opinion for what would happen in the next decade. On another question we asked 2 months ago where we phrased it slightly differently, do you think it's likely AGI will get built in the next 4 years? We saw a majority said they thought it was likely. Either way, people I think are starting to take it seriously that it could happen reasonably soon. Okay. That was Ashley's. What does this actually mean for how people are actually using AI at work? So one question that's debate that's been coming up quite a lot in the last week or two after the trial, I was whether kind of Google search results to Apple had peaked or not. And so it's this question, is ChatGPT and other tools going to kind of like disrupt the search marketplace? So we wanted to look into this a little bit and ask how much were people using AI tools for the kinds of purposes that in the past you used search for. So looking up a quick fact, researching something in depth. And at the moment, search is clearly in front, even if you look at kind of under 35s, even if you look at people who are already using AI. But AI tool is not massively behind. I think it's definitely creeping up there in second place. We also repeated the question we did last year, where we asked about basically the year of agents, and we asked what people's interests were in different agent use cases. This is for under 35s. And again, we see interest in loads of things, starting from detailed research notes, which I assume people are already using deep research, through to personal tutors, virtual workout coaches, through to we still see about a quarter of people actually said they would be interested in a virtual boyfriend or girlfriend. People aren't ashamed to admit that, some of them. What does this actually mean? Oh, yeah, sorry. One thing that might hold up adoption is if people feel that it's inappropriate to like kind of rely too much on AI at work. Is it like getting an AI to do your homework? Is it a bit of cheating? So to kind of test that, we kind of gave them kind of a battery of different kind of scenarios of when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate to use AI at work, and see if people would have some reluctance there. And I think it's fair to say that we didn't really find a lot. The only place where people start to think it might be inappropriate to use an AI is when we get right to the end of that kind of slide there. So at the far left is quite just use it for background research, pretty much everything, so that's appropriate. At the far right, using an AI tool to basically do the whole thing, 48% still think that's appropriate as long as the customer is happy. So just completely go out of it. When we looked at kind of how people were finding these tools, overwhelmingly people gave us quite positive feedback. So I think we saw people across all the big ones, ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude, said they found it helpful at work. Also, I don't know if you're like me, but basically every bit of software I've used in the last 6 months adds a new AI feature every month and then pesters at you about it, or pop up. So we asked people if they noticed all these new AI features, which they said yes. And then we asked them how helpful they actually found them, whether they found them useful or they're just a bit gimmicky. And about over 80% actually they did find them helpful. They were finding some use from them. And I think partly because people are starting to integrate these tools, we're seeing that this pattern that people are now saying that they think AI tools will be important to how people do their job well in the next 5 years. A majority overall, it is slightly higher for younger generations, but it's pretty high across the board that people think learning AI tools is going to be important to how you do your job. Are people confident on that, or do they think they'll get left behind? So I think whenever you ask people if they're confident it's going to poll, they tend to say yes. But even that said, that caveat aside, people seem to be reasonably confident that they'll be able to learn AI tools for their job. With the slight sidebar, older generations, when you get above 55, it dips slightly that people worry they might get a bit left behind. An issue we had slightly more concern about was this idea that as AI automates kind of like entry-level tasks, you have kind of kicking the ladder effect, that kind of if an AI can do the job of someone fresh out of college, what do people fresh out of college do? And we did see that there was some concern about that, again, particularly for younger generations. And then the big one, how likely do they think an AI will be able to do their job altogether in the next 20 years? This is repeating language we've used before. I think it's fair to say, so we asked them on a scale of 0 to 10 how likely they thought it was, and the average kind of hovered around 5 everywhere. But within that, there were some interesting gaps. So men, younger people, and graduates, interestingly, were more likely to think that AI will be able to do their job. And then if they'd used AI themselves, they were significantly more likely to. Okay. And then on impact on employment, perhaps unsurprisingly, but people by quite sharp margins think that AI is likely across kind of political divide to think will increase unemployment. And then as part of that, they again, across the political divide, pretty much think that the government should try and stop that from happening. They don't think that the government should just not stand back and let jobs have been taken over by AIs. And again, not a huge passing divide on that. Okay, a little sidebar on robots, but it will be relevant, I hope. So first off with, this year is the year where kind of companies like Waymo are really kind of scaling up kind of autonomous vehicles across the country. I think it's coming to DC next year, last I heard. Despite that, we saw there was still a fair amount of uncertainty across the population as a whole. A majority thought they would be unlikely to take a ride in a self-driving car or taxi if it was in their area. The reason for that was not particularly mysterious. It was because they still thought that it was more dangerous to ride in a self-driving car, and that it was to have a human driver. And that, again, wasn't just kind of a cautious elder generation thing. That was fairly true across the board, that they still felt self-driving cars were dangerous. Despite that concern about danger, that didn't mean they thought the technology was hugely far away. So on average, people who thought that they were likely to be able to take a ride by the end of the decade. So this wasn't a kind of, it's not going to happen. It was that worried about safety. The thing I think is most interesting about this, though, is that if we actually just zoom in on people who kind of live in an area like San Francisco, where you could already order a self-driving taxi, then this gap in kind of perceived safety between self-driving cars and humans completely falls down. So orange is kind of everyone, the blue is kind of they live in an area, and you can see that it's almost equal whether they think it's more dangerous or safe to ride in a self-driving car. which I think both tells you something about how that debate is likely to evolve, and is probably quite a good metaphor for a lot of AI issues, that people tend to only have kind of their views change a lot when they actually have concrete experience rather than being something bigger than the abstract. A quick another robot. So another thing that's been bigger than these last year is kind of humanoid robots, kind of startups like Figure or kind of what Tesla's been doing. Most people are favored of this in the abstract when we ask them, but they kind of like the idea of having household robots do their chores, again, a kind of cross kind of demographics. But they also, I think, are not prepared to pay very much for it. When we ask people kind of what they're willing to pay, we're looking kind of household gadget style, like $500,000. This is, you know, your new Roomba. It's not car level, so I think it might be a while before costs come down. Less fun type of robot, drones. So we asked people what they thought, which weapons they thought would have the biggest impact on war for the next few decades. As you can see, across partisan divides, drones are right at the top, ahead of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, let alone kind of traditional tanks and ships. And when we just asked people kind of like an outright binary, like did they think drones would significantly transform warfare, we saw kind of just complete huge agreement there that they thought autonomous drones would radically change warfare, rather than they would always be secondary to other weapons was the trade-off we gave them. I remember about 10, 15 years ago, there was a kind of this movement to kind of ban lethal autonomous weapons, that they were trying to kind of create a global treaty to do that. Which I hear less about. And I think the ship has really sailed on that. So we asked people, do they think the US needed to stay at the leading edge with drones, or do they think they should set an example and not develop this technology? And as again, you can see across the board, people think the US needs to stay at the leading edge kind of overwhelmingly, rather than kind of try and not develop drones. That brings us on to nationalism more generally. So one question is, which countries would you be comfortable to use a model from? So we asked this in a few different ways, kind of which countries would you be comfortable using from, which would you prefer to use from, and which countries would you definitely not want to use a model from? We see this across, not surprisingly, people always prefer to use the model from their own country, and not hugely surprisingly, people were less keen to use a model from China, UAE, or Russia. Perhaps conveniently, we didn't actually ask about Saudi Arabia, given that's the news today. But we also asked who they thought was ahead, the US or China. So people did think the US was ahead, 43% there, when we asked strictly between the two of them. But it wasn't a huge lead. Like over a quarter thought China was actually ahead of the US already. And then interestingly, as the thing I mentioned, we also ran this poll in a few other countries, and opinions obviously get more complicated when you come out of the US. So when we ask about model comfort, you can really see kind of different geopolitical stuff here. So India, for example, is actually more pro-US than quite a lot of countries, but it also doesn't that bothered about Russia. Singapore, as kind of your middle of the road, kind of Southeast Asian country, is much less worried about China than like UK or the US or India, and more worried about the US too, on the other side of it. And then if you ask about not just which countries they're trying to be comfortable with, but also who they saw as the lead, then you can see again that there's quite mixed views here. So India actually is more pro the US being the lead than the US, which I was a bit surprised by. Singapore, and interestingly, the UK, for some reason, I don't actually agree, but anyway, seem to think China is already ahead of the US in kind of model leadership. I think this was one of the big themes from kind of the Senate session last week. It's that if the US was to keep global leadership, it's not enough to just have leadership in the US, it also has to kind of take a lot of the rest of the world with it. And we can see this is already quite not a one-way battle. We also asked, by the way, for people who'd already used DeepSeek as just a test, and I think about 85% of them said it was as good or better as other models that they'd used. Finally, that brings us on to policy. So let's start off with some positives. I think when we asked people kind of what the benefits they thought of AI, we saw kind of cross-partisan agreement that the big three were accelerating science, helping with health, increasing productivity. But as I kind of touched on at the beginning, we see more agreement on these big abstract things, but it's interesting. If you ask about increasing wages for workers, it's right at the bottom there. People don't seem to have kind of made the connection between the two. Again, what we do see kind of these nuanced views. So we all wanted to test like where and when people would be comfortable using AI. And so we asked about quite a few fairly sensitive use cases. So things from teaching students, diagnosing patients, detecting crime, making art, hiring and screening job candidates, or even drafting legislation, which I think it's UAE is looking into. And again, we see actually quite openness here. So people aren't happy with AI doing on its own. That's just the orange thing at the bottom. But if you just add in some human oversight or even have the AI as an assistant, you see that people are very comfortable with AI being involved in these decisions. They don't want it to be completely opposed at all. What do people think are the biggest risks? So this is a question we've run a few years in a row. And at the moment, it's still mostly misinformation risks that come up the top, or deepfakes, then some criminal cybersecurity, and then unemployment and jobs at the top. Whereas the worries that people care less about are kind of bias, discrimination, or kind of existential risks. In the abstract, so we asked the same battery of policies that we asked last year. So we asked about 20 different policies. And you see in the abstract that people are generally in favor of kind of a wide range of them. So there were 5 that actually I think had a majority. So I guess because of the misinformation concerns, requiring AI content to be clearly marked, banning the use of AI content for political campaigns, banning export to hostile governments, interestingly an international one had to support, create intergovernmental organization to monitor AI safety and security, and then more controversial from a policy point of view, requiring AI companies to disclose details about their AI models. When we looked at kind of the partisan breakout of that, it's not gigantically surprising. So Democrats are more in favor of kind of social security net, kind of like more government stuff. The Republican side, I thought, was a bit more surprising. They're slightly more in favor of just slowing or banning new research into AI altogether. But what I actually thought was most interesting was the year-on-year trends. And what we see here is that actually there has been kind of a drop in enthusiasm for policy, full stop. It's not overnight, everything is changing, but you can definitely tell there is a clear fall. So for each of the policies, we ask people, do they think it should happen now? Are they open to it, but not just yet, we can come back to it, or do they just think it's a bad idea, full stop? This is, should it happen now? Literally none of the policies did that go up. Every single one, it fell. And then similarly, it was a bit more mixed, but if we look at kind of this is people thinking things are just a bad idea, again, it kind of went up above the board. We did more digging on this, and it didn't seem to be driven by kind of a partisan thing. This wasn't kind of Republicans going more against kind of regulation. This was across the board. We just saw a slight chilling effect where people were more skeptical about policy in general. Bringing it to a conclusion, as I've thrown a lot of slides at you, I think there are 2 final slides why people are a bit more cautious about regulation. So one kind of a nihilist argument I always wonder about, like in practice, can we actually slow technological development, or will technological development happen and we should just make the best of it? When we asked this, we saw, again, people really split across demographics. But on general, people, a majority thought that you couldn't slow technological development, even if we were worried about it. And then this was the same question that we asked last year, where we asked people to prioritize slow, responsible AI development, if you like, versus staying at the technical forefront and staying ahead of China. And what I think is really interesting, actually, this has obviously been a massively amplified in kind of the national discussion, the international discussion over the last year of tariffs and everything. But if we look year on year, it's within the margin of error identical to the finding we had last year, where it is completely split. And about 55%, I think it is, say that they should prioritize staying in the technological frontier over safe and responsible development. And again, that divide is quite split over different demographics. It's not a clear partisan story. All of which is to say, I think there's going to be a lot of policy arguments that keep going the next few years, and there is no simple answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that overview. Yeah, as you said, you threw a lot of data, but it's all really, really interesting data and facts. And just wanted to jump in and start digging into this. And I want to bring Matt and Miranda into this conversation to start. And I think maybe Miranda, I'll go to you first. I mean, I guess maybe as a starting point, you've been working in this space for a long time. You've had a lot of conversations with people about AI. Do you see a shift in sentiment and how people are talking about the risk and concerns with AI in both the maybe outside the DC bubble and inside the DC bubble? And how do you see that changing? And what do you think causes any shifts that you see?
There definitely has been a change. And I think the major factor in that is that AI now feels tangible. There's an interface to it, whereas before it was an infrastructure behind the scenes. And I think that bore out in the responses to the polling in a way that also might be confusing, which is that people might be responding to the polling questions about the types of AI that feel tangible, which are the interactive chatbot types, which is not necessarily the primary way that the technology will diffuse or affect people's lives. But it does give people an intuition about the capabilities and the way that it could be useful in a way that they maybe didn't have a decade ago or even 5 years ago. And certainly the media environment, I think, continues to shape what people's perceptions are, both in terms of the risks and in terms of the use cases and failure modes. And so there continue to be stories about all the different ways that things could go wrong and all the different ways that people are using technology, but what the aperture of that attention, I think, has both turned, pivoted and widened.
Matt, similar question for you. I mean, what shifts have you seen in your work in this space?
I think the big shift from my perspective is that, scroll back a year ago in 2024, and this is actually borne out in the data. I think there was a lot more fear about this stuff when ChatGPT was released in 22. After that moment, it took some time for people to really understand what this was, really get used to it, and really get their hands on it. And as a result, largely in 2024, people started to get a little more fearful. There was a lot more narrative around apocalyptic concerns, things like AI perhaps being used to generate recipes for chemical weapons that could be used for terrorist attacks and things like that. We saw that a lot. Both in conversations I had with people, but also in the media. And it took some time to kind of iron out those concerns. Now, moving into 2025, I think that type of thing, I'm honestly hearing that significantly less. And I can't really say what the reason for it is, other than that I think in part people are used to it. They have seen what ChatGPT can and cannot do. They're certainly consistently surprised at how it's being innovated and how fast it's moving, but it doesn't feel like something that's going to end the world. And I also think to the point about media, on this specific narrative, which is such an important narrative in the policy space because it has driven a lot of legislation, I think the media did get kind of bored of this one. At first, when journalists reckoned with this technology in the early days post ChatGPT, I think they didn't quite know what questions to ask and what framing to apply to these things, so they naturally defaulted to the sci-fi, which I think is decently understandable. But over time, I think that they started to get more interested in actually how it is transforming society now that it is transforming society, and we've seen that type of thing drop off. And as a result, in the statistics, we've seen fear, the number of people reporting that they're scared of this stuff also dropping off. And I think that's a good thing overall.
Miranda, you made a great point. I want you to maybe tease it out a little bit more about how what people think about AI is so much based on the chatbots. It's based on the thing in front of them versus the broader kind of long tail of what AI is and what it can do. I remember, I think it was last year in the survey, there was a question you had about asking people, what is AI good at? And, like a lot of people thought it was good at math, at the time when it wasn't good at math. And it was a way of kind of showing that people didn't really understand things. I guess I'm curious, what do you think, where are those gaps in terms of what AI really is and capable of, and maybe even where there's more risk that people aren't considering versus how they understand it, and how does that impact how people are thinking about the risk and challenges of the technology?
It reminds me of the early internet policy conversations where, people might not have been thinking about it at all before it existed because it was a very, research-oriented endeavor. And then as there became interfaces that people could use, it became apparent what it could be good for. But there were still quite a bit of there are many layers of where decisions were being made that were not visible to people. So how traffic is routed, how decisions were made about hosting, things like that. And a field kind of sprung up around those really interesting technical details. In the same way with AI, again, the kind of chatbot interface is an interface to something that's much more powerful, I'll say, just from the sense of it can do a whole lot of different things at varying levels of quality. But we haven't yet seen, and I think people won't necessarily feel the ways in which those systems end up plugged into A, one another, and B, all sorts of other systems that they generally interact with. It will become sort of an invisible part of the infrastructure, managing sort of payment, transactions, search functions, potentially in terms of ranking different responses to queries. We're already seeing integration of product recommendations. People will plug in the interpretive abilities of LLMs into tools that they might already have been using, like decision-making systems, which maybe will make them a little bit more nuanced and will still present the same type of risks that people who were concerned about automated decision-making had before, which is that they're being used at all and maybe not with enough oversight. But these are generally processes that are happening behind the scenes. They're business processes. They're about interfaces between organizations and companies, and not necessarily things people are thinking about in the day-to-day. And I think that will only continue to increase as the landscape of what people are calling AI agents kind of expands, because that envisions that there will be many, many, many different systems that are interacting with one another very quickly behind the scenes. And there will be an interface that will feel intuitive and sort of AI-like, but the layers behind that are going to be where some of the key implications, risks, conversations probably will need to end up being in the tech policy conversation, even if people experience the things as related to disinformation or job loss or things like that, because that's sort of the output side of the equation.
Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, one, were there any findings from this polling data that surprised you? And two, you do this research globally. I'm curious, what, when you think about what you found in the United States, is there anything that sticks out as, well, that's, either that's distinctly American or unusual for America, or, just this is how, the United States is different?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, taking those in reverse order. So, I mean, it's a bit obvious, but I think on the US point, I think it is very much the focus and the competence in US leadership is not shared in the other countries. And that was partly, I guess, because we deliberately went to Asia because we were trying to put the dividing line between the US-China race. But I think in general, and this is partly, I spent a lot of time talking about people about AI policy in Asia and Europe, and there is very much a sovereignty conversation in general. It's very easy to talk from DC about American leadership, but basically everyone wants to be a bit in control of their own destiny when you talk to them, especially policymakers. On the stuff that surprised me, so I think this follows on some points you guys were making. People in general just are very bad at asking and thinking about abstract hypotheticals, and I think you're exactly right that people kind of respond to what they have experience from. And I don't know if you found this, but I find everyone sort of has a moment where they discover AI can do something and they go, oh, okay, I'll take it seriously now. Like, in my business, when deep research came out 3 months ago, and we were like, oh, okay, that's like half our junior staff, like it's better than, oh, okay, this is really bad for our company. And I think you're totally right. People are doing chatbots, kind of using that as their model. I didn't touch much on it in the data I showed you guys, but we did ask about kind of long-term risks and AI taking the world and all that kind of stuff. And if you ask people like hypotheticals, like, do you think this an advanced AGI would be really dangerous? People say yes. And if you ask them why, they'll give you a reason. But they don't, I think, use that as a model right now, which is why it kind of is less of prioritization. And looping back to your actual question, Daniel. So one of the things we tested at the end was another series of hypotheticals, because I think of this movement of should we just pause AI research is too dangerous? And kind of what would the threshold be? Like, is it a robot kills someone on the street? Is it kind of like an AI says it's sentient? What level do you have to get to? A chemical weapon gets released, kind of those scenarios. And I think we got this more and more kind of doomsday-ish. And I think the last one I gave people was an AI causes a nuclear war and blah, blah, blah. And even on that point, I think there was still 40% of Americans who didn't want to stop AI research, even if half the world had been blown up by nukes. So I think, which is either great faith and the confidence in R&D, or I think is just, I think it's just very hard to get people to take abstract stuff seriously. I think until it actually happens, we're not going to really know what people think. Which is why it's good to track it, as stuff changes.
Well, and I wanted to ask Matt if you talk about that point too, because I think that's an interesting one. This idea that the survey found that Americans generally think AI is going to make life better and not worse overall, except they also have all these very serious concerns about misinformation and job loss. Matt, how do you think about those kind of competing ideas?
I think it's hard to say because it really does depend on the individual. But I think in terms of the positivity versus the job loss thing, specifically, I think that in part, I do think that people, I don't know if this is 100% true, but may have more of a tendency of seeing their own personal life and their own personal jobs and their own personal tasks that they're doing as more complex than the tasks that other people are doing. And therefore, perhaps are perhaps slightly less concerned about their own job getting automated away because they see that it is a basket of tasks, not like some flat thing that can be one-to-one taken away by AI, and therefore can see how AI can be useful in their work, that type of work. And I think contrasting that, people are much more likely when they view, say, your job, like data analytics, right? Maybe they see that as, they don't understand what happens under the hood. So they see it as, you're producing reports, maybe we can just automate that. And the AI can go out and do the polls, and maybe that's easy to get rid of. And so when they think about the macro perspective, maybe they think, yes, job losses are happening because everyone else has these simple jobs that can be easily automated, but my job is very complex. I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but I think people are more likely to think that their own world is just, like I said, much more complex and therefore harder to automate and harder to be impacted. And therefore they can see the value in how it can improve their own efficiencies.
If I can jump in on that, I think it's interesting to observe that and then also imagine that the people who are building the AI systems also maybe make assumptions about how simple tasks are versus how complex and nuanced the people who are actually in those domains understand them to be. So some really interesting research from a while back, but I think is still relevant given the enthusiasm about the medical domain, is that it's reasonably easy to build a predictive model for diagnosing some kind of disease or indicator for a disease or reading scans or something like that. But when a hospital actually goes to deploy that technology, there's a lot of people who are like, I'm not going to use that until this is how I operate my day. And it tends not to be the people that people expect to use it who will need to use it. So it's not necessarily doctors, but nurse practitioners who are the ones actually having conversations with patients. And so I think all of these domains where developers presume that AI will be able to do a task, but also where there may be opportunity for disruption, are somewhat more complex than they end up being. And I think that's where a lot of the risks come in because of those assumptions that aren't taken into account when building the technology. And so once organizations attempt to deploy it, it ends up failing in a way they didn't anticipate because they don't think of that, more complex operational environment. And I also think, just jumping back to your point about sort of personal recency bias in a way of what people are most familiar with, there was a question where I think this was put in relief, which was the general fear about unemployment and then will it affect you? I can't remember the exact one, but it seemed to me that people's assumptions, it was about the AI versus climate change. That's a very, I think, really interesting comparison. And it seems the difference is whether people are thinking of the impact on the country as an aggregate of impact on individuals or as the externalities and issues that might arise that don't relate to the direct impact on individuals. And if people can imagine losing their jobs, maybe they don't think they're going to lose their own, but they imagine many other people will. The sum of that is a big impact. Whereas thinking about externalities like trust in institutions or, failure to advance, R&D as a country are not as tangible. They're more abstract, as you said. It's more difficult for them to wrap their head around what that impact looks like. So that suggested to me that's why AI kind of rose above climate change.
I thought it was interesting on the jobs one as well. On the entry-level jobs, there was the slide that broke it down by age group. And it was the younger people who were concerned about the impact on entry-level jobs, but not the older workers. And presumably more of the older workers are going to be doing the hiring for the entry-level jobs. So I guess it works in their favor in that case. I did want to stick on the question about scientific acceleration, since that was one of the seemingly top benefits that people identified. And it's something that Congress is looking at right now, very, very clearly. I guess, maybe, John, I can start with you. Do you have any sense about what kind of scientific advancements people might be thinking about? And then, Matt, I'd love for you to think about, on the policy side of this, is it realistic? Should we be putting effort behind this?
I don't have a great answer to some of things. So we've done other polls where we test similar things, and it tends to be, it's one of those kind of motherhood and apple pie things. We say, do you want scientific advancement for this? They say yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, for almost everything you've tested. We have actually done some economic modeling on it though, like where we kind of looked at kind of the potential. And it does kind of, you don't have to assume a huge amount to kind of get quite significant R&D acceleration, I think, just from that. So yeah, I think it is a massive opportunity. I think in terms of how the public think about it, I think in general, people tend to have a science is great and it's fairly unpartisan, and so that's what people pointed to it. But, and I think most of them aren't scientists, getting back to our points. They don't think that's not my job to accelerate science.
Matt?
Yeah, and so first of all, I just want to make the point that I can't point to data on this, but I do think that in general, with regards to the scientific advancements, the public, this is one of those areas where they're undoubtedly going to be behind in what they think is possible, because they simply just don't know. I think using AI to generate new drugs is to cure various diseases. That to me is like one of the most exciting possibilities that's basically here now today. I don't think most people know about that. I think if we are to present them with certain examples like this, maybe we would see even a bigger boost in the excitement that's already there. Now, you asked about public policy and how people's interest in using AI and science might inform some sort of public investments in R&D. And I do think on that point that it's very important to distinguish general excitement and interest that might be expressed in polls like this with any interest in a federal program. These things are very different. And when people start thinking about federal programs, they start thinking about trade-offs. If we're funding AI research, or even AI research to cure cancer or something like that, what else could we fund with that money? And I think those questions might end up sneaking their way into people's heads. And I think there's actually some reason to think this would be the case. People would have more doubt for a program over just to bootstrap.
We did have some data on that. Yeah, that
really? Okay, yeah.
That was one of the more cross-partisan divides. The Republicans were skeptical in general about kind of R&D funding research, as you'd expect. But that fell apart.
I'd be interested. So if there was an actual program presented, what the actual reaction to that tangible thing would be, because if you look to history, like even the Apollo program, if you look at public opinion polling, it was basically negative the entire time. People have these rose-colored glasses about like public support for it, but people basically throughout the entire run, except for when we did the moon landing, thought that money could be best spent elsewhere. So I think the idea that any sort of excitement might translate into support for a program once the program is presented, there's that connection's a little tenuous, and we'll of course have to see. Excitement is certainly a feather in the cap of any congressman, but I don't think it necessarily means support.
And I would just warn that even if the government now were, truly motivated to advance R&D, which is hard to believe given all the cuts that are happening, it would be tempting to redirect R&D funding to AI, given the excitement and the potential here. But I think that would be a mistake to do so at too hard of a pivot, because whereas people are presuming that if you just throw enough text and compute at AI models, they'll be good at generally everything. What you actually need is domain expertise to develop, at the very least, tests for whether those systems actually work in the domains that they're intended to work. Because usually when you have sort of this cross-domain capability transfer that people expect to see and sometimes do see, it's hard to know if that's reliable for actual use cases without engaging with experts who have done research in that domain and not in AI, in order to know if we can rely on AI to help make advances in that space. And I think it's related to the entry level ladder kicking problem, which is that if you don't have people who know sufficiently enough about the thing you're trying to assess whether AI is good at, then you're not going to be able to use it very well, and you'll also break that pipeline for decades to come.
Miranda, I wonder if you can stay on that point for a while, because I did think it was really interesting in the skinny budget that came out. It was very clear that this was that they were trying to preserve funding for AI and increase it, and as you said, cut funding elsewhere. And there's been this interesting tension in government in general, where they can't. There was an attempt to make like a select AI committee, right, in Congress, and the idea was, well, we should have all the AI expertise here, and of course the counter argument is, no, we need AI expertise everywhere because you need the subject, domain subject expertise. But the counter is also true, right? And that's why you hear in this constant debate about, well, you have subject matter expertise in these different domains, but they don't have AI expertise, and so you have a lot of projects that just throw in the words AI because it's nice, it looks cool, it's advanced, we're gonna use AI to detect whatever. So how ideally should Congress think about navigating this area where if we did want to sustain funding in science, but also make sure AI is contributing to it? Do we need AI research outside of the science and inside of the science? Is it a both? Is it do we really need to focus on AI expertise first and then port it over? How would you approach that problem?
I think that the NSF actually did some really interesting work in this area in the last few years. They had a particular grant program that encouraged collaboration across domains, which is always a challenge within traditional research, because the peer review process and the way academic departments are organized makes it difficult to get credit for collaborating. And I think that's where funding could encourage more of that collaboration, because I don't think there is an answer to that it lives in one place and includes the other, or vice versa. The most important point is that it doesn't only get funneled to one without consideration for the other. To me, AI is like money at this point. It's like finance. Everyone has to sort of understand it at some point in the development of policies and research about any topic. But it becomes, again, just a competency and understanding. You don't have to be an expert in it to have a sense of when you need to bring in expertise. And so I think cultivating those ties and the matrixed approach is going to be necessary. And again, including people who have real world experience in these contexts where people presume AI will be deployed is often overlooked. And I think we're not going to get the benefits out of it if we don't invest in that. And some of the recent attempts to kind of slash fundamental research based on assumptions about what it will accomplish, I think undermine that, because we don't necessarily know what domain related knowledge or sort of political science or economics or social science insights are going to be critical to actually ensuring that AI does achieve that vision.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think this is ultimately where things are going to have to go. I mean, you can't just do research in a vacuum. To actually have the impact that you want to have, you have to understand the thing that you're trying to impact at any sort of level. Now, just to use an example from the digital realm, we've actually learned over time with cybersecurity something completely different, that you can't just treat cybersecurity different from other digital domains. You have to, the best practice in that field is to fuse your, have broad cybersecurity knowledge so that engineers are using these practices throughout their development life cycle. And when you have cybersecurity engineers, include them on the teams that when you're ideating, when you're putting together the first draft of your code, when you're doing X, Y, and Z. And that's how you actually create things that are secure. And I think with AI, it's going to be the same thing. If you want to use AI in healthcare or something, you got to start talking to the doctors. You got to then work with the engineers on whatever medical devices that might be involved, this, that, and the other thing. And that's how you're going to get something seamless and truly impactful and something that's efficient.
Matt, maybe I can stick with you for a moment. Misinformation, right? That was one of the top concerns. I think that was the top concern last year too, or it's up there. As you know, when we talk about AI, that obviously comes up quite a bit. What do you think policymakers should be doing about it? What should private sector be doing about it? Is this an area where they should be acting, or is this a concern that will be, dissipating over time?
Yeah, and so misinformation, generally the idea that AI can be used to create things like deep fakes of the president saying something that might be misleading, or just false video, things like that might try and be used by nefarious actors to spread information that's just simply not true. This is one of the big topics that has been around, honestly, for longer than we've had ChatGPT. This narrative has been going. And I think this is a real thing. I think that this is something we should take seriously, right? We should always be skeptical of anyone who's trying to attempt to muddy the information environment. But I do think that over the last couple of years, policymakers have somewhat done this topic a disservice with how they've approached it, which is by framing it as a truly systemic issue that's going to create a post-truth society, that's going to undermine elections, all of which, some people should be thinking about, but not everyone. And unfortunately, when we're talking about the misinformation problem, what has been largely sacrificed in service of these more systemic concerns and conversations has been more local, more micro misinformation problems. Specifically, I'm thinking about things like evidence in a courtroom. It goes without saying that if we can generate images and video, then there's going to be attempts to fabricate evidence. There's going to be attempts to claim that evidence presented in a court of law is generated by AI, and that's going to happen if it hasn't already happened. And that's the type of thing I don't think that enough people are thinking about, because that's at all levels of government, that's going to be an issue. It's almost guaranteed to be an issue. And that's one of those truly foundational things that we should be paying attention to. And I think, unfortunately, because we've been talking so extensively about these, misinformation around elections issues, things like that, these kind of nuts and bolts issues haven't been fully addressed. And I think we should, readjust our attention towards those more micro concerns.
Miranda, if you want to weigh on the misinformation part, you're welcome. I also wanted to ask you, I guess, there was this long list of AI risk up there. And I'm curious, do you see good alignment between how the concerns that Americans are expressing and what the private sector is doing around AI governance and the types of issues they're working on?
There is some overlap, and there's also some disconnect, but this sort of recalls for me conversations that happened in the 70s and 80s around what risks are prioritized when it comes to science and things like chemicals and whatnot. And there are some findings there. If you don't respond to the risks that the public is expressing, they're going to be skeptical of any response to risk because they don't think that you're actually addressing the risks that matter. So I think addressing both the risks that the public is attentive to and ones that the developers who are closer to the things they're building and maybe can foresee a set of risks that others can't appreciate is probably the right way to go. When it comes to misinformation, I think focusing on precise types of it is helpful, because if you try to address misinformation sort of bluntly and sloppily, it's very easy for that to end up coming back and ending up as a tool that cuts off a lot of important expression. Many examples of countries that use misinformation laws as a way to kind of shape public discourse and in a way that I think we wouldn't as a public think align with democratic values that we're trying to imbue in AI as we're talking about this race between countries. I think we all have to decide what are the values that we actually care about when we're pushing American-led AI, and I don't think that would be one of them. The government deciding what misinformation was or wasn't, but there's a lot of technical and sort of societal level investments that could be made in making it easier to kind of have that debate.
Mm-hmm. Can I comment quickly? So I was quite surprised, actually, because I think that misinformation stayed so clearly at the top. I think what you were saying, like last year, it was kind of the year where half the world had elections, and there was this kind of, ooh, what's going to happen with AI deepfakes of something? And it was kind of the dog that didn't bark. There was no real huge scandal at any of the big elections that I recall. And And yet, we did more digging into this information in last year's poll. And I think also people had very different ideas what that meant, depending on where you were in the political spectrum. If you were a Republican, you were worried that was to Democrats censoring you and vice versa. So it wasn't really clear that people had a consistent idea when they were talking about it. I think it does come a bit back to what we were saying about people just identifying the concrete things they've everyday experience from, which is why I think it's more retail. I saw something on the internet wasn't true, and I worried about it. Coming back to something you were saying earlier, Dan, about stuff that's different internationally, one thing I find interesting actually is in a lot of the more emerging markets in Asia, like above misinformation is just kind of cybercrime and scams in general, just because I haven't quite figured this out. But I think it is because labor is so cheap. There is an even more kind of just consistent, like endless, like people trying to scam you online. And so that's the thing that everyone worries about hugely. But whereas out here, it's not quite as bad, which is why misinformation still peaks at the top.
Was scams on that list? I can't remember.
I can't remember either, but there's a lot. There's that. Yeah.
So I want to turn briefly to the robo-taxis, self-driving vehicles. As you mentioned, this is coming to DC soon. I expect Washington will care more about it when it's here than when it's on the West Coast. Matt, maybe I'll start with you on this one. You saw the numbers up there about, the trust. One of the things I think is interesting is that, the older Americans who are most likely to benefit from self-driving vehicles making, transportation more accessible are the ones that are most resistant to it. But we've seen this before with technologies, cell phones, that kind of thing. I'm curious, when you see a slide like that, how do you think that impacts, the potential adoption, but also the kind of the policy reaction to various concerns?
I think it's just going to be a function of experience, and I think the data seems to bear this out. When people see these things, they're going to be much more likely to trust them. And even as somebody who reads about the safety of AVs, and they really are, they really do appear to be safer than human driving in a lot of contexts. Even it took me actually stepping into one of those vehicles to realize that I had like a visceral distrust that I didn't, fully embrace until I'd actually stepped in one and felt the safety improvements. Now, I think unfortunately for like older Americans, getting them to experience those things, they're not going to be like out at the bars with their friends and that, they got that one tech savvy friend who calls the Waymo for them, which is, I think, a scenario that a lot of people will experience. That will be how a lot of people experience their first cab, at least with younger people. They're not going to have that. And so I think in part there, it's going to have to be on the part of Waymo, working with various organizations and institutions. Maybe they can have like Waymo for nursing homes or whatever it is, right? To try and get people to work those things through these concerns. But I do think that there is going to be a certain amount of uphill battle, and just raw exposure, that's the only way to get this done. And I'm glad to see Waymo is expanding to DC, and I really would encourage them to expand elsewhere, even on smaller scales, so that people can just see it and experience it, and therefore start to trust it.
Brenda, I'm curious too, in terms of, San Francisco's deployment of it has been interesting because of also the backlash against it, right? That we've seen people, tagging the vehicles, blocking, barricading them, that kind of thing. How do you, part of, when I see that, I think, well, one, this part of this is like California kind of crazy things going on there, but also part of it, it represents, there's a certain sentiment, people are angry, people don't trust this technology, that it's a representation of emotions and feelings that people do have about the technology that aren't getting addressed in some other place. So I'm curious, when you saw that data, what you think about it.
I think that people, again, this is an example of where the world is much more complex than the technology that's being introduced into it. And so, on the test streets, it might be that these work very well, and it could be that, and for the most part, they generally do work really well and are not engaging in the type of accidents that general people do. But when you integrate a new technology into a very complex system like a city, like a traffic pattern, it will tend to fail in ways that maybe you don't expect, or that even if they happen rarely, are disruptive to people who have not chosen to use that technology. And I think that is likely to happen in all these less tangible cases as well, where it might make sense, in fact, to adopt adopt the technology, but if people don't trust it, then they're unlikely to adopt it. And I think that's where, the conversations about regulation or other types of, standards where people can demonstrate that they have taken safety into account, could make a difference if people, have some kind of signal from a source they trust that the people developing a technology have gone about it in a way that addresses some of their main concerns. They might be more willing to get in it for the first time, and then their intuition can kind of take over. And I think the challenge with some of those less tangible AIs or the chatbots is that the way that they've gone about trying to test them in the wild is to release them to everyone all at once in order to gather information about how they fail. But at the same time, that's led to a very rapid adoption in places that maybe the trust isn't warranted. And I don't think we have currently a good way to parse out when that's sort of a wise strategy and when that will lead to the type of backlash people see, because again, they're sort of hitting up against very complex contexts and institutions and communities that have opinions and that have existing patterns and assumptions that the technology needs to integrate into, and that interface between the technology and that broader context tends to be underinvested in.
Matt, I want to also talk a little bit about China here. And, there's obviously the slide about how many Americans are reluctant to use AI made by a foreign country and, China or a foreign company. So I guess, and, as we saw on the other slide, that bears out also with other countries thinking about, the United States and others. Who do you think should be responsible for addressing these trust issues? Is it incumbent on the U.S. to do anything to help create trust in U.S.-made AI, or is this something that individual companies should address on their own? And similarly for foreign companies trying to do business in the United States, should we be looking at standards for AI systems to provide confidence that if they're on the American market, that they're trustworthy?
Yeah, so I think with regards to using Chinese versus American models, one of the biggest issues regarding trust is data security, data privacy. There's plenty of data, if you're not aware, that if you're using DeepSeek's officially hosted app, they are sharing that with the Chinese government. So watch out for that. Don't be doing that. I do think on this point, though, that I don't think it is on the part of the U.S. government to be dictating things. I think that we should ensure that all technologies that exist in the world that we have access to, because that's inherently beneficial to our engineers to be able to study those things, actually discover whether or not there's bad data security practices and discover these issues. And of course, it's on the part of the consumers to learn about these things. But obviously, that's not always going to be the case. I think in part, we should just continue to have good information about what's going on with these applications. What issues do these foreign applications have? And also in terms of American applications, and I think there's plenty of incentives for this. We, of course, want to do better, right? We want to be competitive. And I think that with regards to privacy and security, just basic business and some regulatory incentives are already pushing industry to try and do better than China just naturally, right? If I'm a US business, I'm not going to contract with ChatGPT unless they assure me that my data is going to be sandboxed. It's going to be, it's not going to be shared widely with other organizations. I have my proprietary data, and they have bent over backwards over time to try and ensure that, and they're getting better and better. And I think that's the type of incentive that will ensure that we are much more trustworthy, at least on these issue sets that are really kind of the crux of any conversations about insecurities with foreign AI applications. And so I think overall we should be fine. Of course, we have to wait and see if there is some big problem, we'll reevaluate. But for the time being, I think we're all right.
Miranda, thoughts on this kind of global governance or foreign?
I'm curious to Jonathan if people elaborated on why and their reasoning, because in many cases, while I think this conversation is important and there are sort of values that differ across these countries, I tend not to hear the sort of logical flow of like, what is the threat model people worry about apart from privacy, which I think is very tangible. And I think there was an announcement just last week or 3 days ago, or maybe an hour ago, I can't keep track of things anymore, of OpenAI announcing that it was going to partner with countries around the world, starting with 10 or 20, to develop AI for countries, support governments, and kind of deploying AI within their country, which is going to necessitate changes to the core model for in a variety of ways, whether it's linguistic, sort of cultural context, or potentially even the types of interventions that maybe would make people less comfortable with using them. For example, hostage-taking laws that require the company to kind of bend over backwards to comply with local laws that maybe we wouldn't feel so comfortable with. And I think we haven't fully grappled with what that means. And a company being based in the US doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to uphold the values we expect them to uphold when they try to globalize their operations. And we've seen that, on a number of occasions with more traditional tech companies, Google, Facebook, expanding around the world, and changing policies in different places to comport with those laws. And what will that actually mean for the threat models that people anticipate? I haven't yet seen really nuanced analysis of that. Right now, I think the question is generally asking people about their vibes of different countries.
So I think there are two debates. There is the general public debate, which is very much just a vibes-based thing. It's which countries they trust and which they don't. But then there's also just the elite debate, and I've had that discussion with quite a lot of different policy people. And I would say a lot of it is mostly a sovereignty thing. It's they, particularly to come out to Europe and Asia, they don't want to be dependent on either the US or China. They want to be in control of their own destiny, and they don't want to have a critical technology stack that they're not in control of. And so that means A, they want data stored in their country. B, preferably they want it built on an open source like Llama, which they know what's going on. And they know that they're probably not going to create their own foundation model, which I'm quite surprised by. I thought they would update more after DeepSeek, but most of them aren't ambitious, but they do want fundamentally not there to be a kill switch that someone could just turn off, something that could be critical for their military economy in 5 years, basically. And then it kind of goes, again, lots of geopolitical complication of which countries that they think more they want to be dependent on. But that is basically the stuff that's in the conversations I've had with them.
I wonder if Matt and Miranda, you can reflect on that, because when you go through that list of what countries want in terms of sovereignty, is it open source? Well, yes, we have Llama, but China's 100% in terms of open source AI for the most part. No kill switch. Well, there's a lot of various proposals for a kill switch, from California to chips to export controls. So it seems like we're doing everything that everyone else outside of the United States doesn't want us to do, and I'm wondering how that impacts American
Not
competitiveness.
surprised me. The person I was most skeptical about DeepSeek was the head of the AI app in Taiwan, who was trying to give you a long lecture how you cannot trust DeepSeek and people should not build on top of it.
Yeah, I think this is like actually one of the greatest threats that people aren't fully grappling with in terms of our national competitiveness, is the idea that right now the US government is really pushing this idea of AI dominance. We want to dominate the world and have everyone using American AI. And I think that alone, that message, and the downstream things that we might do to implement that type of message, that's the type of thing that is going to turn people away from American technologies. No one's going to want to use something that feels like it's trying to dominate you. That's just not, I wouldn't use that app. If France said, we're going to dominate you with our AI, it's like, I'm not going to use your app. I don't care if it's like, better than the one I have. I'm not going to touch that. And so I think that any policies in service of that type of thing, any policy that is like trying to pressure other countries to use our technology or things like that, or control their access to technologies, I think has these political risks that are going to turn people off and turn them towards the local grown or open source models they are already fundamentally biased towards. And as a nation, our policymakers really need to be sensitive of that, because we could really ruin things.
And it gets back to trustworthiness, which is that we don't know a lot about a lot of these systems. And if we raise the head because we think we're going to win on a set of metrics or benchmarks or amount of compute or amount of parameters, is that really going to create the trust that would lead to the diffusion that that is expected when it comes to leading AI? And my guess is no, because when people actually decide which tools to use, they're going to test the utility, but they're also going to assess whether that's the right strategic choice to deploy a model. And most of the ways that we're measuring best right now are, again, very disconnected from the actual use cases that people envision kind of deploying these models to advance. And so I think we have to question, what are we racing against here, and what are we leaving behind along the way in the interest of that race? And I think, even with some of the open models at the moment, it's interesting that they do have more information available. They do let people kind of change them in ways that give them some more visibility into the implications. But none of the tools that are widely used at the moment disclose what data they use to train their models on. And like the reasoning, could make sense, but at the same time, that distribution of data and the steps that they do or don't take to filter out different types of data or prioritize certain data in their reinforcement learning or post-training have a major implication on what those models will do and how they'll behave over time. And right now, there's not a lot of information that deployers can use to decide if a model meets their needs, is trustworthy enough, or will accomplish their goals in a way that doesn't introduce some kind of failure mode down the line that they're not willing to take on as a risk. So I think trustworthiness is really important. Right now, we don't have really a stable environment in which to establish the standards that people generally agree signals trustworthiness, and I think that's a huge miss.
And Miranda, I mean, one of the takeaways from Jonathan's slides was about how more Americans are starting to use AI for search-related tasks. In fact, I was actually surprised. I thought it would be higher. I mean, and maybe it depends on how people perceive that. But I guess I'm curious. Do you think there's been all these debates about? First, there's debates about transparency and accountability of AI in general, but there's also all the content moderation debates, free speech debates that have been going on that are ongoing right now. How do you see those intersecting in these AI models, especially ones that are closed source or closed weight models? And so it is the company that's ultimately putting out the model. Curious where you think things land in that part.
So 2 parts of my answer. I think one is that to the extent there are decisions being made around how models behave and the responses they provide, the companies could be doing more to share how they're making those decisions. So both Anthropic and OpenAI share versions of what OpenAI calls a model spec, what Anthropic calls a constitution, and my team is really looking at the opportunity there to help communicate what's going on so people can decide. Right now, these systems are somewhat fungible. They're like good at slightly different things, but in general, they're providing similar utility. So people, might use this as a way to choose which one, best meets their needs or accomplishes their goals. On the second part of the answer, I think, again, because these are systems that are present themselves to people in natural language and appear to be encountering similar content-related problems that people are used to experiencing in social media contexts or other internet-related contexts, there's a lot of attention being paid to what comes out the end of an AI system, and I think not enough that is going into what's happening along the way, because again, once these systems are interacting with one another behind the scenes and ultimately resulting in some kind of output, there's a lot of ways that could, minor choices or minor bugs could cascade and lead to outputs that are ultimately problematic, but slapping a classifier on it or like a content moderation approach doesn't actually solve the problem. So I think people have over-rotated to the content-related harms related to these systems simply because that's the modality that they're interacting with them in. But again, that's the interface, not necessarily the core of the technology. Not to say it's not important, and it affects people's trust in them and their understanding of what the companies are doing, but there's a lot more to the picture.
Matt, any thoughts on the kind of free speech parts of this and where that's heading?
Don't regulate it. Right now, one big concern I have on the content that is being produced by these things and overall is that we are seeing bills now introduced to stamp out specifically political bias in these systems, which I just see as an immense risk on multiple levels. First of all, what is political bias? How do we define that? I have no clue. We're all biased in some way, and every single model is biased in some way, and it's kind of hard to spell out what exactly that means. We have model, like you said, model specs and stuff that try and spell these things out, but even those are incomplete in terms of the overall biases that we might find in these things. And I just overall don't think it's the goal of regulators to do that. But unfortunately on this, we do have like active bills in Texas, for example, trying to regulate this. The vice president and the head of the both the FTC and FCC have voiced interest in doing some sort of either regulation or investigations on this to try and influence these things. And I think that's just a huge mistake. Now, freedom concerns aside, people should have the freedom to develop what they want that expresses the speech that they want. I do think that any effort to regulate or mess with what these things can produce in terms of content and how they can be used in terms of content production is, on the China front and the international front, actually quite an unrecognized risk. If the US government or any state governments start regulating the content that these things can produce, everyone's going to see our models as propaganda. And we're just not going to be competitive abroad. And so this is, like, to me, like a regulatory third rail. Let's not touch it. Just let people develop what they want to develop. Let the market run its course. And right now we've got plenty of competition, plenty of models for people to choose from to fit whatever political needs they want. And let's allow that.
Before we turn from this, there was this new Senator Mike Lee had an obscenity law proposal, legislation targeted at the internet, but obviously you could see something like that, which hasn't been a part of the AI discussion. Do you see that potential regulation coming down, and would that impact free speech in AI?
I could see it for sure. I don't know if it would be constitutional. I'm no expert on that, but I don't know. I mean, I think there's obvious limits, right? There, like child pornography is one of those things. Like, sure, let's regulate that. But beyond that, I think that's when we start getting into all sorts of gray areas. We start, over-regulating. We open the door for increasing creep of what counts as obscenity. Maybe today it's pornography, tomorrow it's swear words, and the next day it's this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's just not something we should embark on. Obviously, with those illegal material, truly illegal material, I think we can all agree that that's not something we should generate. But beyond that, let's not start that process.
So I want to open up to audience Q&A. Before I do that, there's just one last question I want to make sure we get in, and that's that, right now there's, Congress is talking about a potential 10-year moratorium on state AI laws. I did think it was interesting that, Jonathan, you said there has been this drop in support for all AI policies across the board. So I wanted to ask our panel, does that indicate, this drop in support indicate that maybe a pause is actually something that would be welcome by the public, that they're saying maybe don't do something on AI regulation? Miranda.
If I'm not mistaken, one of the items that the drop in support for included was that we should move cautiously in regulating these things. So it seems like there was drop in support for everything, and I don't know how much we should read into. Maybe people are dejected about the state of government in general and not speaking to the particular topic. But there also was polling out of Pew about a month ago, where I think both experts and the general public expected at a pretty high rate overnight that, or were looking for more approaches from government to regulate some of this. So I think there's potential issues in just phrasing and framing and recency bias and who's in power. And I think another thing, although you didn't see, I think you said a gap from a partisan perspective on this. There's a particular bent of this government on like what they seem capable and competent to regulate at all, and not necessarily how they would regulate. That I wonder if people are like, I don't know if this is the time to do it, because what that would do is doesn't seem to be in anyone's interest. So I'd be curious to dig more into those findings. I think that moratorium we're very concerned about, given the number of different domains that AI will touch. It seems very difficult to make sure it only applies to the technology and not anything else it touches. And there are just so many examples of harms that people have been talking about for a very long time, that there remain gaps in addressing, even with existing law, and the speed of the development of AI, that seems like a very unwise move to us.
Overall, I would say I'm not supportive, but I'm sympathetic to the moratorium. But I do think that if we turn to the public and ask them about this type of thing, the data on their, mixed data, obviously, but data on whether or not they think we should slow down regulations. I'd be very curious to see if, when you introduce the idea that the federal government is telling the states they cannot regulate these things, if people change their minds. I can imagine, talking about all this sovereignty stuff, right? People from Texas, people from California, they would get up in arms, I think, to a certain degree about the idea that they can't spell out their own destinies. And whereas I personally, as like a policy wonk in DC, think that every 50 states regulating AI is a bad way to achieve either innovation or safety. When you start telling people what to do, I think their opinions will change. And I think that if we were to drill down on this issue and drill down on the fact that it is the states who can't regulate it, I think people might change their opinion, but I can't say for sure.
Well, like I said, I want to open up the question. We have a lot online, but those who brave the rain will get the first question. So please, we have a mic.
I'm a bit confused because the engineers that I trust most, whether that NVIDIA or Jan LeCun or Demis Hassabis, are really talking about analyzing deep data in ways that hasn't been possible before. That's where you're going to get leaps, probably in biotechnology, or leaps in maybe reducing cancer because there's a lot of environmental data, or even better ways of mixing agriculture or preventing disasters from weather, etc. So I'm a bit unclear whether we feel that the subject matter AI, when you take an opinion poll, how much do people actually look at it in terms of the way the best engineers are of, is this an application which is really moving forward deeply with data, or is it just some kind of, media game? Because a lot of chats are in some ways just an extension of social media or analysis of that sort, which seem to me not to be the exciting parts of where AI could sort of help make the world better for everyone.
So I think, as we were talking about earlier, I think people, when they talk about AI, increasingly they do think of ChatGPT or whatever, and that is kind of where their head goes, and that drives responses and in either direction, things they're worried about, things they're less worried about. As we were talking about, I think actually when you get to those kind of more technical things, kind of the AlphaFold accelerating kind of biological research or whatever, that is pretty uncontroversial. That's why science was the top benefit that people liked all across the board. The only times people are against that are kind of people who might be worried about biological weapons or something, but that's very niche. That's not really a general population kind of concern. But yeah, I think mostly when people think of AI now, they do basically think of ChatGPT in a way that they did 5 years ago, where it was probably more an abstract thing. But even then, I think it would probably be driven more about kind of forward-looking automation, jobs, robots, all that kind of stuff, and not kind of like data analysis kind of stuff.
We have a number of questions online I want to get to. A couple quick ones. So one, when was the survey taken?
The survey finished literally a week ago, which has been quite a fast turnaround, I think. It's very recent. Yeah.
And then another one, was there an update from last year's survey and how many people were open to a relationship with an AI chatbot? So I know you mentioned the data, but you can do a comparison.
Yeah, so I haven't got the exact year-on-year numbers on hand, but yeah, we asked that same question again. And as you saw, it was about a quarter of under 35s who said that they were open to it. So it's definitely not dying away.
a couple of, these are all about kind of methodology, so I'm going to stick with you, Jonathan. Did you find anything on levels of AI literacy in the public, either generally or in comparison to last year's findings?
So we asked less about kind of those questions that we did last time, just because we think like the usage numbers that people have more kind of experience. I think if we did ask questions about how it worked, we'd probably see low kind of literacy, but yeah, we didn't prioritize that this time, so no new data to go into it, I think.
Okay, and then opening up to our panel on this one, a question came in about basically, how do you assess what the Trump administration has done so far, has indicated it will do on AI policy versus what Trump voters have said they want in the poll? Any thoughts on that?
This is actually one of my most interesting takeaways from the poll is the disparity. The number of Trump voters who expressed an interest, as you called out, in slowing down potentially AI research is quite different than the overall tenor of the administration, which I would describe as accelerationist, meaning they want to plow forward on AI. They're very pro AI. This is one of their top issues, and I think in the short term that difference isn't going to matter, but I do wonder longer term. In the next Republican administration, whatever that might be, is this the type of thing that might slowly shift the Republican Party away from this pro-AI stance and towards something that is much more aligned with their base? I can't say if that is going to be what happens, but if this sentiment gets strong enough, I can imagine that type of thing will happen, and I think that will have a profound impact on our policy and moving forward.
I was struck by the distance between the population of people who are worried about job loss, whether their own or kind of in general, and the distribution of people who thought that the government should prevent those job losses, as well as the folks who were looking for stronger social safety nets, because I don't think that the current administration or the Republican platform has generally supported things like labor rights and protections in that regard, where that's what people seem to be looking for in light of this fear, as well as support in the event that they are displaced from their jobs. So it seems like that will be a sort of clash if those job loss fears do come to pass. And just coming back to a previous question about who was worried about some of those things, I can't remember exactly the question, but it was interesting that a high proportion of the male and young population was more worried than others. And it's been my experience in talking to engineers lately that they've now realized that their jobs might be affected, whereas before the types of jobs that could be automated away were very different. And that might change, who has the appetite for what when a different population, and I think white collar, jobs in general are faced with this challenge more than they used to be. And so I'm curious how that will affect people's perceptions of policy interventions.
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't say at any point today is that when you ask people, the Gen Pop, about AI in general, obviously they say it's important, but if you do a standard issues tracker of what people care most about in policy terms, it's still a long, long way behind inflation, immigration, your bread and butter political issues. But reflecting on what you're saying, I think it's interesting, and this is hard to test in a poll just because you don't get the samples, but you get these niches of people who do care because, so I always say translators or graphic designers, the people everyone knows looking at is panicking, or Hollywood actors for some reason, which I'm less convinced why that's happening. But yeah, those are the people who actually it's more concrete for them, so they take it seriously as a policy issue, whereas for most people, it's not going to affect their vote for the next year or two.
Last audience question I want to make sure we get to that came in was a question around AI education policy and how that fits into this. So, hey, Jonathan, you can start, anything around AI and education or how students should be, getting literate around AI. And then for the panel, just in general, what's your takeaway in terms of, obviously people are thinking AI is accelerating quickly. That was one of the first slides. And, they care about this. To what extent should we be integrating AI into education and improving AI literacy as well?
So I think we tested this in this poll too, or if not, we've definitely done a poll recently. But in general, I think people kind of accept that AI is going to affect education, and you can't really stop students using it, at least not when they're not in an exam room. So people want to work with it, I think. And we didn't ask specifically about skills you'd asked, but I think you saw from kind of the workplace questions and kind of the kicking out of early career that I think people do accept that figuring out how people work alongside AI is going to increasingly be important in how you kind of train people up, and you can't really ignore that anymore. Yeah.
I think we do need to start though with the teachers. I think a lot of I would assume a lot of the teachers don't know what to do with it. And so you can say integrate it, but until they know deeply how to use it and what they know as best practices are in their heads, they're not going to be equipped to do these things. And so I think that as the states, as they consider their various curricula, should be actively focusing on getting the teachers up to speed so that then, and this has to happen immediately, basically, then we can start adequately teaching the students who will be using this, whether or not we teach them how to appropriately use it. So this has to happen today, but we do need to do some groundwork on this.
Can I just do a quick follow-up on that? So we just finished a project with Google in the UK where we did some pilot studies of how to get teachers to be more comfortable with AI. We did it with teachers and I think with nurses too. And it doesn't take a lot, actually. Like a few hours of intervention we were seeing were kind of leading to long-lasting doubling of AI usage kind of 3-6 months later. But you just needed to give people confidence and give them a chance to actually try it out for them.
Just to add on, Alabama has done some work related to this where they found exactly the same thing. It doesn't take very much on either AI or computer programming to get people up to a certain level to help them start to teach the students the skills they need to deal with this future that we are heading towards.
Right,
And
to give you the last word.
Sure. There was an executive order about pushing AI into the education system, which I think, given the way in which we don't actually know how to use it in general, seems a bit premature, and especially given all the issues of bias that already exist in the education system and the additional executive orders that make it harder to actually spot and remediate that. That's certainly a concern. But I think when we talk about AI in education, people might jump to the vision of AI tutors or things like that. It doesn't have to. We don't have to go from 0 to 100 there. There might be uses like generating alternative versions of questions that are more relatable, or kind of developing study guides or things that don't require replacing frontal education or experiential education with a chatbot. That might be valuable, but I think you're right that people don't know how to use it, and just exposing them doesn't give them the sense of like what's actually going to be effective in teaching. And the education department had been developing resources during the prior administration to help guide that. And I think with the dramatic cuts to that department, that's likely to go away. And I think people will be looking to figure out what resources can they turn to rely on that will lead to the integration of AI into education in a responsible way. But so far, my colleagues are looking at this quite closely, and a lot of the products that are being marketed to education professionals for AI are basically just ChatGPT and wrappers, and they don't have enough information to actually determine if they are built using any knowledge of the educational context whatsoever. So again, going back to simply like throwing general purpose technology in a new domain, we saw this with like one laptop per child. Like there's a lot of assumptions around what it will do that might not bear out, but it could be useful if you actually work with the people who are in that domain and know what's needed and are able to distribute the knowledge of what works and what doesn't. And if we, deploy it quickly and without thinking about it and it goes wrong, people are going to be less likely to use it in the future, not more. So being thoughtful and being deliberate are important. It doesn't just mean we're moving slowly.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our excellent panel. And I really appreciate first, Jonathan, for coming here and sharing the data, and obviously for the conversation we've had today. And thank you all for braving the rain today. Thank you.